In the past few years, the narrative about Southern Europe has changed quite radically. Countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even Greece, that were literally the synonyms of economic crisis, unemployment, and misery, are now growing faster than their Western European counterparts. Spain's economy has been called the envy of Europe, Greece, the economic comeback of the decade, Portugal, the digital miracle, and Italy as the unlikely outperformer, and all have been hailed as the new growth engine of Europe, leaving their northern European neighbors in the dust, as the struggle of Southern Europe seemed finally over, and as things were looking bright once again. Except that this story, that has been painted by headlines of countless major newspapers and a lot of politicians, is not real. Not if you ask the people in those countries who haven't really seen any improvement or progress in their own economic reality. And not if you look at what's behind the headlines and the overall numbers. Because then, the appealing story of the Southern European economic comeback starts to fall apart pretty quickly. Because this is not a happy story of going from rags to riches, no matter how much you want to see it there, and things are not getting better. Instead, the reality of why these countries show an economic growth and what that means for the regular people is a lot more depressing than even the economic crises of the past decade. And if anything, things are only getting worse. So this is the big lie of the Southern European economic boom. But to understand what's happening today, let's unpack the context and how we got here in the first place. In the early 2000s, 20 years ago, Southern European economies, and mainly those of Spain, Portugal, and Greece, have all been going through their golden economic era. Traditionally, these Southern European economies have been poorer than their Western and Northern European counterparts, but in the 2000s, they were having a pretty good run, and in fact, they were having probably the best economic period in their modern history. Most of it was due to the fact that by the late 1990s and early 2000s, they all adopted the euro, the common European currency, replacing their former national currencies, and by doing so, entered the so-called eurozone. And for all of them, that had one major, hugely influential advantage. Suddenly, and without doing anything to deserve it, they could borrow a lot more cheaply than before. The thing is that traditionally, investors would see the Southern European countries as a lot poorer, more indebted, and less responsible with their finances, and they had good reasons to think that. And so they charged them a lot higher interest when they were borrowing money. But once these countries entered the Eurozone, investors started to see all of them as if they all were Germany, safe and low risk. And so their governments, businesses, and regular people were able to borrow at much lower rates. And in almost no time at all, that sparked a massive borrowing and spending spree across the entire Southern Europe. Governments felt free to take on debt, build all the highways and infrastructure they wanted, and increase the already generous welfare spending even more. People who saw their growing wages and cheap loans started to spend like never before, fueling a boom in housing prices. And companies took advantage of demand and increased the supply, flooding the markets with countless new properties that just kept going up in value. And foreign investors who saw all of this rushed in to invest their money in these new booming economies as well, since it looked like Southern European economies were now catching up to Northern Europe, and there was so much money to be made. But in reality, this boom was based on false assumptions and confidence. Southern Europe was not catching up, they were simply temporarily able to borrow a lot more than before. The growth was almost entirely fueled by debt rather than by improved productivity. The boom in asset prices was a completely unsustainable bubble, and the governments were out of control with their spending, increasing their already massive debts. And then in 2008, it all came crashing down. When the global financial crisis hit, Southern Europe was hit harder than almost anyone else, starting the worst economic crisis in its modern history. Almost immediately, the real estate bubbles burst, especially in Spain, leaving it with thousands of now almost worthless properties that no one was able to pay for. As businesses were failing and declaring bankruptcies, government revenues collapsed, and banks were suddenly exposed to all the bad loans they held. Investors started fleeing southern Europe and selling their loans, and Greece reported that it was massively underreporting its deficit, basically faking its numbers. Suddenly, panic was everywhere. Things were falling apart, and it looked like the banks and the entire economies of southern Europe were about to collapse. To save themselves from the worst, the southern European economies were forced to request a bailout from the European Union and the IMF. That came with harsh austerity measures for the formerly generous government budgets. Hundreds of thousands of public sector employees were laid off. Pensions, unemployment, and welfare benefits were slashed, taxes went up, and public spending into everything from healthcare, education, or policing were cut to the bone. Unemployment quickly skyrocketed, reaching 25% in Spain and Greece, and more than 50% among young people. And with no hope and no jobs to be found, millions of young people left to try to find economic opportunities somewhere else. The next 10 years or so saw very little progress. Even though people were initially understanding of the need to cut costs, after years of economic crisis and brutal austerity, understandably they started to get fed up, leading to political instability, far left and far right populism, and a loss of trust in institutions. And countries like Spain and Greece found themselves in a vicious doom loop, when weak economies would lead to falling tax revenues, which would lead to higher budget deficits that required even more austerity, which in the end led to even weaker economies, creating a spiral that looked like it's never gonna get better. Which is why it was so surprising when the tone of news about these countries in recent years started to shift. Especially in the post-COVID and Ukraine war period, when inflation, cost of living, and energy prices brought down economies across Europe, including economic giants like Germany, southern Europe suddenly looked a lot better. Greece was finally recovering, Spain and Italy were now growing faster than most of Western Europe, and articles about southern Europe now being the new growth engine of the EU just couldn't stop coming. But what is the reality? And if all of those countries are doing so well, then why are the people still miserable? Because while Spain is lauded as an example of a booming economy, 63% of Spanish residents consider the economy to be doing badly or very badly. And while the entire southern Europe should be having its moment, young and qualified people are still leaving in record numbers, as they still can't seem to find any real opportunities. And well, that's because the reality is a little different to the media headlines. And if we take a look at why southern Europe is actually growing today, it becomes pretty clear why. Because at the end of the day, the current growth comes down to basically two sources: tourism and immigration. As for tourism, this industry is currently having its moment all around the world. After COVID artificially suppressed demand in this area, it came back even stronger after the pandemic ended. And tourism is now breaking records globally. And since southern European countries are tourism hotspots, both for people from Europe and outside of it, it's not that surprising that they would be the primary benefactors. But the thing is that tourism doesn't really bring you the kind of growth that you want. Yes, it can boost the economy, especially if it was already weak before, and it creates jobs, but the jobs it creates are low-paid, unqualified, and seasonal. Think waiters, hotel staff, and people who sell you towels. These jobs don't provide growth potential, high wages, or even stability. And while tourism can be a nice addition to your economy, no country ever got rich from tourism alone. You can't scale it, you can't innovate it, and there's a natural ceiling. And once the current tourism boom ends, the growth stops pretty quickly. And the second source, immigration, is not much better. In a strange paradox, even though most southern European economies still have quite high unemployment of around 10%, they also weirdly have a pretty massive worker shortage. That's because there are actually millions of jobs that are unfilled, but those jobs are almost all unqualified, typically in tourism or hospitality, and mostly offer salaries so low that they make it almost impossible for you to survive on them, especially if you live in a bigger city. And so many of those jobs that no one wants because they pay so little are filled by the only people desperate enough to take literally anything: migrants. Which is why in Spain, for example, 9 out of 10 people who have entered the labor market in the last 3 years are immigrants, mostly from Latin America. But that doesn't really help anyone. Having a lot of immigrants who are desperate enough to take any job to survive drives down the already low wages even further for everyone, and it creates more pressure on housing, which Spain already doesn't have enough of, and makes the cost of living even worse. And while Spain is an example, the same dynamic applies everywhere. As a result, the statistics which create the impression of booming economies are largely misleading, and they fall apart pretty quickly at a closer look. In Spain, while the GDP has grown, the GDP per capita has grown a lot slower, because part of the growth was just caused by having a larger population because of immigration. In Greece, even though the economy is growing again, GDP per capita, and real salaries are still much lower than they were prior to 2008, meaning that people are effectively a lot poorer than they were 20 years ago, and they're left with massively underfunded and barely functioning public services. In Italy, the economic boom that was briefly fueled by massive government spending has fallen off just as quickly as the government subsidies ended. And everywhere in Southern Europe, salaries have been stagnating for the past 2 decades, while prices have been going up. Unemployment among young people is still sky high, qualified people are still leaving, demographics are still getting worse, and none of the underlying factors, like productivity, that actually drive long-term growth have changed. And when the post-pandemic tourism boom inevitably reaches its peak and slows down, that reality will hit very hard. The point is that while economic statistics can be very useful, they can also manipulate reality, and they can paint it in a better light than it actually is, which is what has been happening in the case of Southern Europe. But that can never last, and it doesn't help anything in the end. Presenting figures as a success makes no sense if those figures lack context, if they don't actually make lives of people better, and especially if they won't even last very long. The reality is that Southern Europe is not booming, and the sooner we stop pretending like it is, the sooner they can start working on making a real economic transformation come true.